right, let's start up. Hey, everybody. Good evening. So this is a workshop meeting. So that's where our council does our business. This happens to be the fourth Monday of a 5-Monday month. Ordinarily, the fourth Monday is off, and we would do workshop on the fifth Monday. But the majority of the council agreed that it was preferable to do it today. So we will be off the following Monday, the fifth Monday of April, and we'll do the workshop now. And then the first thing we're going to do is what we try to do each year, which is an overview of the assessment process. And we have with us Judd Siebert from Keen and Bean, and Kathy Martin, who is our assessor. And I'm going to turn it over to you, unless, Chris, you want to add anything?
No, just we're doing our annual presentation about assessments before the assessment letters go out, and we thought this was so successful last year that we asked Judd and Kathy to come back and talk about their process and what people can expect in May when the letters go out. So I'll just turn it over to you guys. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you for having us again. It is that time of year again. And when we were here last year, and we were also here this summer just to talk about the process, it was acknowledged and agreed, and I think a good thing, to have us back right before we hit the assessment cycle for this year, 2024, and we're at that point. Your annual assessment cycle is just going to begin in just a little bit over a week. On May 1st, which is the first key date, the city will issue its annual assessment roll with a series of what is known as tentative or proposed assessments. Each taxable and even exempt, but each taxable piece of real property is identified on the roll, identified by the owner, identified by the tax ID, by the address, and is assigned a value, an assessed value, a market value for purposes of the levy of taxes. That May 1st roll is, as I said, it's tentative because every property owner in the city of Beacon has the opportunity to challenge, or we say grieve, the tentative assessment before it becomes final. They do so by filing with the city a standard form complaint. It's a New York State Form RP 524 complaint. It's very simple to fill out, and filing it with the assessor's office. And that complaint is then tendered to the City Board of Assessment Review, which is a duly constituted board of the city. It's a type of board that's in existence in assessing jurisdictions throughout New York State. And it has the authority to review and hear property owners who want to contest or challenge their assessment on the basis that it is, overstated, or fails to account for an exemption, or that there's some legal flaw with the assessment. The key date for that Board of Assessment review, that complaint needs to be in before the Board of Assessment review, before it meets. On this year, it will be May 29th. And as the mayor said, this month is kind of a quirky calendar month. We recently amended the city code to make it clear that it is the Wednesday of May for the city of Beacon, the Wednesday of May following the fourth Tuesday. The reason for that, the city has an alternate grievance day from other municipalities, including towns in Dutchess County. So it's Wednesday, May 29th. Property owners who file the complaint are free to come in before the board. The board will entertain and hear complaints throughout the day. The time of the convening of the Board of Assessment review will be on the city website for notice and for property owners to take note of. And I think one thing I want to underscore with regard to property owners, it may sound a little daunting. It really is not. The board, it is not nobody should be intimidated by filing and coming in before the board. I want to make that clear. It's a process for the property owner to come in and just articulate why he or she feels that their assessment needs to be reevaluated before it goes final. The board will meet at the end of May. There will be a period of time when it can consider all of the complaints that are filed. And then in July 1st, the roll will become final. And when the roll becomes final, and I'll reiterate this again at the end of the presentation, the only recourse at that point in time is to challenge an assessment in court. And there are two ways to do that. If you're a residential property owner who resides, in your residence, you can file with the court what's known as a small claims assessment review proceeding, which is also sort of a DIY simplified process of filing a complaint with the Supreme Court in Poughkeepsie, having the assessor then evaluate the SCAR paperwork that's filed, try to work it out, and if not, it doesn't go to a big courtroom with a judge. They're actually court-appointed SCAR hearing officers that conduct informal hearings to determine whether the assessment should or shouldn't be sustained. The other avenue is like a full-blown tax certiorari proceeding. That is the recourse available to property owners who are not residential homeowners, although residential homeowners can, if they wish, go step it up with a more formal court proceeding. The tax cert proceedings that are brought under Article 7 of the Real Property Tax Law, those are heard by a judge in Poughkeepsie. Those are typically commercial cases. So that's kind of the arc of what we're looking at over the next couple of months. And if I could just go with the first slide of the presentation, just to, again, kind of go over what this process is about, what it's intended to do. So the first thing that Kathy and I always try to underscore in this presentation is that the purpose of the assessment process is not, certainly it has to do with the levy of taxes and the collection of taxes. But the key thing about it is assessments are really the mechanism for the allocation or the division of taxes. Each taxing jurisdiction, the school district, the county, the city, they're going to determine their own budget, how much they need to collect in taxes against the entire community that's subject to levy. The assessments are simply the mechanism to determine how that levy is distributed on basically on an ad valorem or a value-based system. So that, and we say that because an increase in assessment, and I'll get to that momentarily too, how the city is engaged in an annual program, but a property owner who gets a notification that their assessment is increasing, that may or may not automatically correlate to an increase in taxes for a couple of reasons. One is that, particularly in Beacon over the last number of years, the overall amount of assessments has been increasing in significant, in a significant measure. That is, more and more value is being placed on the assessment roll. So the pie is kind of expanding, and in turn, each constituent piece of the pie may be on a pro rata basis, smaller and smaller. And the other piece is that assessments are not tax rates. Tax rates drive the amount of taxes. So the rates may be stable, rates may go up, rates actually may go down because of, as I just mentioned, the increase in the overall assessment base. So we just want to make clear that people understand that the purpose of assessments is not to collect more taxes, it's simply to have the mechanism for dividing the pie, and having everyone pay their sort of pro rata share based on the value of their property compared to the value of all other properties in the city. So go to the next slide. This is kind of restatement of what I just said, but again, assessments themselves are not taxes. The amount of taxes, the tax rates that are applied really are derived by the budgets of each of the taxing jurisdictions. So the school will soon be voting on its budget for next year and what it will need to collect. The county and the city will do so as you get to the conclusion of 2024 for bills that will go out in 2025. And it's that overall amount of what needs to be collected for budgetary purposes that's then apportioned and collected based upon assessment of individual properties. So as I said, a change in assessment does not necessarily result in or correlate to an increase in taxes. And as I also said, when you have additional assessments coming online by way of new development, by way of an increase in rateables or taxable properties, it's going to diminish the amount of it's going to diminish the allocation of levy taxes upon individual parcels. Next slide. So, as I said, notices are, well, as Chris said, notices are going to go out. There will be a change in individual assessments between 2023 and 2024. And that is because the City of Beacon, which adheres to an annual revaluation program, annually reassesses all properties on the city tax, on the city assessment roll each year. This is really, in terms of assessment administration, this is the best practice in terms of overall fairness and equity, which is the objective of the assessing process. It is because every property gets kind of a fresh look every year. The whole roll is evaluated each year. And what you avoid is, and I live in Westchester as an example. We have communities in Westchester County that have not engaged in a municipal-wide or an assessing jurisdiction-wide reassessment since the 1960s in some places. And so as a result, assessments on residential properties are expressed in like less than $10,000, because back in 1960 a house was worth $9,000, say. And what happens in those circumstances when you have a stagnant roll is, one, the state comes in annually and makes a determination as to what the appropriate so-called equalization rate is. It's a state-derived ratio that is supposed to express the difference between the actual market value of all properties in a municipality against the assessed values, and that equalization rate is then applied to this fractional assessment to express it in sort of real dollar terms. It's a very skewed process. It creates all kinds of uncertainty. That, coupled with the fact that when you're in that type of program, there's very little a municipality or an assessor can do to change or adjust assessments. Assessments often go down because of successful certiorari challenges, and you really get a very checkerboard, kind of skewed assessment roll in those circumstances. The better practice, as is done here in the city, is to have, it's kind of like assessment hygiene, have it looked at every year, bring it to 100%. The state looks at the city's role and determines what the equalization rate should be year to year. The city, except for COVID a couple of years ago, where there was a need to kind of freeze the roll because of just the limitations COVID had on the ability to get the job done, the state consistently applies or determines that the city is at 100%, which is where you should be.
Judd, can you use your mic?
Yeah.
Ben is having trouble hearing you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll let Kathy speak basically as to what she does in terms of that practice year to year, but there are a number of factors that are looked at as you update the role. And if you want to go through
Sure.
those.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I think one of the things I just want to highlight that Judd has said is that there is several ways and several steps in which a homeowner or taxpayer can have their assessment reviewed in any given year. Like Judd went through several of the steps. We'll be revisiting them, but we will be sending out the change notices around May 1st, and also the assessments will be available online. But there's, many chances for you to call my office, make an appointment, come in and talk to me ahead of time. You can go to the grievance board. If the grievance board is unsatisfactory, you can then take it a step further. So there are several steps in place for taxpayers to have their issues or concerns addressed. And I would encourage people to do that, to make that phone call, send the email. If you have any questions at all, we'd really like to hear from you. Okay, so as it relates to reassessing and what we do on an annual basis, like Judd was talking about, mostly with the residential properties, there's three approaches to value. There's the cost approach, which is how much it would cost to build a new construction. And there's the sales approach, which is looking at comparable sales to similar properties, or there's the income approach, the income and expense approach to value. The income approach is mostly applicable when you have a commercial property, because for a single family or a two-family home, we're really just looking at the sales comparison approach to value. So what we do is we take all the sales from the city and we stratify them based on neighborhood, based on style of home, based on square footage, based on lot size, and we look at all the sales in any given neighborhood in any given year. And what happens is we do a statistical analysis of all the sales in the city of Beacon, and we come up to what we think is a fair value for what this will be for 2024. Then I send my roll to the state and ask them to pre-verify it to make sure that we will be at 100%. So that's already happened. We've been pre-verified, and the approximate raise increase in the residential portion this year is approximately 6%. So we look at the inventory, we look at the property improvements, and then we look at all the valuation. Adjusted base proportions, we talk to you usually about that in the fall, because we do that after we file the final roll. And what that is really a mechanism where we measure the two different portions of the tax roll, commercial and residential, and because they don't always appreciate or depreciate at the same amount, at the same time. So there's a mechanism that it was voted on by the city council many, many years ago to adopt the homestead option. And what that does, it's kind of like a safety net, so there's no big shift on either portion of the tax roll. So like if the commercial portion grew dramatically, there wouldn't be a massive shift. It protects the residential portion of
And
the assessment roll.
That's an option that is extended by New York State to communities when they, or to assessing jurisdictions if they engage in a revaluation, particularly for the first time, because the concern oftentimes when you reassess, particularly if you have like assessment rolls like I was talking about earlier that haven't been looked at in decades, is that there is often a very significant shift of the tax burden when assessments are analyzed from commercial to residential. So the idea of the homestead option is to create, as you have here in Beacon, two classes of property: homestead, which are your residential properties; non-homestead, which are commercial and in some instances multi-unit residential, and basically to kind of like freeze that pre-revaluation ratio and then adjust it over time so that on a number of factors, and it's a very long, kind of convoluted, mathematical process derived through the state, but it's basically to ensure the safety net, as Kathy mentioned, that you're not placing the onus on residential property owners for purposes of reval.
Okay, should we go to the next slide?
Yeah, so this is where I started. Our assessment timeline, March 1st has already passed, but that is what's known as the taxable status date. Under New York law, all property in the city is to be assessed based on its condition and use as of March 1st of each year. So it's sort of this snapshot approach of valuation that all properties will be considered as of that date. It's also significant with regard to exemptions in terms of making sure that properties seeking exemptions are qualify for exempt status as of that March 1st date. May 1, as I mentioned, is the tentative assessment roll. The Wednesday, and I need to just correct that, the grievance day is the Wednesday following the fourth Tuesday. As I said, that'll be May 29th this year. July 1st will be the final assessment roll, and then there is a very strict 30-day period after July 1st, after those assessments go final, in which any property owner who wants to challenge by way of a judicial process needs to file that paperwork with the Supreme Court in Poughkeepsie.
Oh, and I just wanted to make the point as well, Judd had mentioned earlier about the grievance board. The grievance board is made up of volunteers from the city of Beacon. They're all taxpayers, they're all residents of the city of Beacon, and they are given special training by New York State through Dutchess County to be trained about the law and the deadlines and any relevant information, but they are just people just like everybody else that just volunteer their time.
Next slide. This is just a list of the exemptions that the city continues to extend to property owners. It's not an exhaustive list, but the key exemptions are the STAR exemption, which apply to school taxes, a senior citizen and a disabled person's exemption, which is an income-based exemption. It's for senior citizens, and that's senior citizens as age 65 and older, or persons who are disabled under New York State law and meet certain income qualifications. There is a veterans exemption, actually a couple of different types of veterans exemptions that are available. And finally, the exemption for volunteer firefighter and ambulance workers, which is for both those who presently serve on a volunteer basis with the fire department or an ambulance corps, meet a minimum service requirement, and also a lifetime exemption for anyone who's served with more than 20 years of accrued service with either of those. And the last slide is just a resource slide again. Kathy, as she mentioned, is available. Kathy will be sitting with the roll. That's a technical term, but it's literally what it is. She will be here at City Hall on a series of designated dates in May. Those dates will be on the city website.
Yes.
And again, she's available to answer any questions with regard to the process and any questions anyone has with regard to notices or their tentative assessments.
Does anybody have any questions?
I would just add a couple of things. There won't be questions, but just, simplified bits of explanation, right? Beacon has been in a full value assessment program for getting close to 20 years now, right?
Yes.
We did it with several other communities in Dutchess County. I think it's somewhere on the order of 18 out of the 22 communities are at full value, pretty close
Yes.
to that number. There are a few who aren't. Judd, you mentioned Westchester County. A number of communities aren't there down there, and the rates of grievance are much, much higher.
Yes.
Down there, right? Our order of our grievances are on 5,000 parcels.
A very small percentage, like
Right.
less than 1%.
And I think that's a combination of staying at full value or close to it, and then second, being open to the steps that Kathy referred to, or the early steps that Judd referred to in terms of call the assessor, go in, have a conversation, right? Or, the more formal first step is go to the Board of Assessment review, which is an easy step to do. And that most of the things are resolved there, either to explain to someone why the number is okay, or to say, no, it's different and we'll make a change. So I just wanted to add those couple of things. And it's not that difficult a process, and we're trying to make it as transparent as possible. And I'll stop.
Yeah, and I think there was, Kathy, your information on the last slide here, and then if you go to the City of Beacon's website and then departments, there's a tax collection page which has a lot of really good information, including the grievance form, contact information for Kathy again, as well as the assessor's aid and office hours and all of that. So there's a lot of information on the city website too, if people are looking for that.
Thank you.
I've got a couple questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So how long is it between grievance day and the conclusion of that determination that's done by the SCAR judge? STAR judge?
Yeah, no, so let's back up. So the grievance day is a city-run process,
Right.
okay? And it's about a month, about a period of 1 month, because the roll goes final on July 1st. So it will be this year between May 29th and July 1st. That process will be wrapped up.
Okay. So they would get a letter around that time?
Yes.
Yes, they would.
If they grieve their assessment.
Right.
If they
Right.
grieved, right,
Right.
right.
First, you get a letter beginning of May saying, here's what your assessment is. And then there's an opportunity to either talk to the assessor or grieve it through the Board of Assessment review.
Yes.
And that process wraps up, you said,
July 1.
July 1.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. And procedurally, what's the difference between grievance day and if someone came to you, Kathy, while you're sitting with the roll?
So grievance day, I'm like out of control. Like, I no longer have control over the grievance, over the roll that day.
It's a real party.
Just that one day. So any changes that are made through the grievance board are done by the grievance board. So and there's 5 people on the grievance board. So I'm only one person, and if people come and talk to me and we go through everything and I see where we can come to some kind of agreement ahead of time. What we can come to is a stipulated agreement, and that's right on the back of the grievance form. And so then we would both agree to whatever number, we would both sign that. I give a copy to the person to keep for their records, but then they do get a formal letter from us. So the difference is they don't then have to go in front of the grievance board. But sometimes people will come and meet and, they may think one number, I may think another, and they still, if we don't come to an agreement, I always tell them, that's fine, you still have the right to go to grievance day. So just because they come and talk to me doesn't necessarily mean we'll agree, and there's still always that further step they can take.
So you mentioned the 6%, so my understanding of that fair value assessment that you arrange with the state is that most people should expect a 6% increase. Most homestead owners should expect around a 6%. So if you do your own math and figure out that it's more than that, can you give voice again to what might be contributing to if it's more than 6% to your property?
What would contribute to that would be any new construction, like if somebody put on an addition, in addition to the 6%, like if they changed their property, if they renovated, anything like that.
Okay, great.
Right, last year, that number was
Like 10%,
Yes.
for homeowners, for single-family
Yes.
homes. And we also tried for the first time to put that number into the letter that's going out. On mine, there was a little bit of confusion, but I hope we put that same sentence in that, for individual homeowners, the average increase was.
Yes.
And I think that's proven to be very helpful.
It really was, because when people get a change of assessment notice and they see that it went up, they're like, oh my goodness. But then I think when everybody finds out that everybody else's went up too, it's a little bit easier to understand. And then especially since we've been in this reassessment program for so many years now, I really think people are starting to understand that it doesn't mean the tax rate's gonna go up, it usually means the tax rate's gonna go down.
Yep.
So I think people are kind of getting used to that now.
But my feedback was that 10% number in the letter was really important. I think you heard the same thing.
Yes, absolutely.
And we should try to do the same thing and be as clear as we can be.
Right.
At least for homeowners, they can see the average number, right?
Right.
And for homeowners, last year, they averaged a 10% increase in valuation, but they averaged a tax increase from the city property taxes of only 3.96%.
Yeah.
So it didn't correspond to the raise in assessment because we
Right.
dropped the tax rates.
Right, and most of that had to do with this arcane process called
Adjusted base proportions.
which we'll never get into because
Yeah,
it's just too difficult to explain. We won't talk about it.
You referred to something called an equalization rate.
Yes.
What is that? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it is a New York State computed rate that's done for each assessing jurisdiction. And with regard to Beacon, it's not that significant an issue because you're at 100%. It's good that the state consistently places you at 100% because it says your role is, where it should be. Where the equalization rate comes into play are those assessing jurisdictions that don't go through this process, so that the numbers on the assessment roll stay fixed while market values continue to grow. And the equalization rate is New York State's effort to define the ratio between the total number of assessment value on the roll and the total market value of all properties within the assessing jurisdiction. How do they do that? Whenever there is if you go to a closing, there is a it's called the state equalization form. The TP 5217 form, that goes up to Albany, and Albany Department of Taxation uses that to kind of keep track of value trends. It's like the wizard behind the curtain. It's like adjusted base proportions. Don't tell me how it's done. It goes in a box and they come up with a number.
It can really affect a municipality if you share school districts. So I know, Beacon is mostly self-contained, but not completely. And if both municipalities are not at 100%, if there's any shift, it can shift burden onto, and that's really one of the main reasons why all the municipalities back in 2006 wanted to go, and because it was very expensive process and painful too, because people didn't really understand. The city of Beacon was at 28% of market value at that time. So what that does, if you're not at 100% and there's new sales coming in, and it creates an equity. So we find, and I think the mayor agrees as well, the annual reassessment really helps to, to protect everyone against inequity and keep everything easier to understand too. It is much more transparent, because when you see an assessment of $5,000 in Westchester, like, it's not really, your house isn't really worth $5,000. So I think this is much easier to understand for people.
Yeah, Dan, your question, that 28% was an equalization rate.
Yes.
Okay, and what it meant was, whatever the last assessment, I think it was in the 80s or for Beacon, that different parcels kind of got higher and higher in value, but they weren't all the same. They weren't rising at the same rate. Right? But it's the state's attempt to say, well, you put them at this number, but on average, they're this number in the middle, right? That's the equalization rate. How close to how far from market are you? And then they use that to adjust things like school taxes or county taxes.
And also state aid.
Yeah. Now,
So-
what's important is they're going to be like this. They're going to find an average, but there's going to be some properties that haven't appreciated as much as others.
Right.
And what was typically found was poorer areas didn't appreciate as much, and the grievances were tended to be done by either commercial properties, so they got the right number, or by wealthier or more expensive properties, because it was worth doing, right? And so you ended up with, the ones that can afford it got the right number if they were too high, and of course they left it if they were too low, and so you get these inequities.
Right.
And we were actually able to use data to demonstrate that it tended to harm seniors, and it tended to harm lower income areas and lower value properties.
And that, the other piece of that kind of being beholden to that equalization rate and that kind of inequity, because, as the mayor said, it's a set ratio for everybody. On the flip side of that, in terms of defending tax certiorari challenges, it really plays havoc. And I think when you look, this is anecdotal on my part, but the jurisdictions that our firm represents that are at 100% see far fewer successful tax certiorari, particularly in the commercial sphere, challenges than those that have this equalization rate, because just oftentimes the application of that rate, and if it's an assessment that hasn't been challenged in years, can just instantly create refund liability. So it's also very helpful from a fiscal standpoint.
You don't have to answer this question if you think it would have an impact on grievance day, but are there patterns that you've seen over the years where somebody comes and grieves, and it's the type of thing that's brought that commonly ends up in their favor? Meaning like a case that people make that is a legitimate one that does well on grievance day, and is there another that people come with that isn't so successful of a
Well,
case with the grievance
I
board?
mean, the most successful thing I can think of like that is sometimes senior citizens may be in the hospital during the exemption period, and if we have to deny them. So if they come into grievance day or, send paperwork in if they're unable, and they can document that they were in the hospital, that's almost always a 100% successful grievance. I think really the most important thing is to look at sales. We have tons and tons of sales in the city of Beacon. So that's, when you look at what we have the house assessed at, probably the best information you could bring to the grievance board is sales of similar properties. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Right, and that also points out a resource, right? So Dutchess County has parcel access
Yes.
on their county website. And so you can go find your property. Once you find your property on it, it'll have a map. You could literally, touch and find the assessment of every property around you, and that'll give you a really good sense of, what are the numbers? And, if you think, I stick out like a sore thumb too high, well, you might. On the other hand, you might have a really different property than your neighbors. And that's the part to be sorted out. But it's a really, really good resource. I just encourage everyone to feel comfortable. Go to the county site. You can find every parcel in the county, every
Yes.
assessment, including your own and that of your neighbors.
And all sales too.
All right.
Yeah, so it's a great resource.
Yeah, I would say that's probably the most common question or concern I get related to what Dan brought up. It's not necessarily that their assessment they feel is out of line with the sale, it's that why is mine assessed at this, but everything else around me that hasn't literally sold recently seems to be at a lower value. And so working with you, Kathy, it sounds like at the bottom of that might help to sort of address why it is that their particular property
Yeah.
is potentially different than others
Yeah,
around them.
no, absolutely. And we're happy to sit and take a look at, when people come in, that's usually kind of what we do is go through the neighborhood, look for sales and make sure, one of the first things I do is make sure I have the person's data correct, because that could be something right there, like, they'll say, I took that shed down. Well, we didn't know, so we'll take, it's good to have your data correct, and sometimes it's good just to go through everything and see what we're looking at, so.
And we can put the parcel access link on your website.
Oh, good,
So
okay.
we'll do that tomorrow
Yeah,
to make
that's
it
good.
easy.
Yeah, and we have a
Already
link to the
there.
whole assessment.
Is
rolls,
it?
too.
And then when we announce the letters going out, we'll remind people to
Okay.
go there. Cool. Great.
We good?
Nice job.
Yeah,
Thank you,
so much.
everyone.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I think this is really helpful, and I appreciate you
Yeah,
both
thank you
coming in
so
and doing
much.
it.
It
Yeah.
really is helpful, and it's good to get the word out, so.
Have a good evening.
Thanks again. Have a
All
good
right,
night.
thank you both. All right. Hey, Natalie, are you online?
Smell or something?
No, it's just for parking minimums, I'm
Let's see if
When
we
we
got
start
anyone.
throwing stuff.
So, Ben, can you tell if Natalie Quinn is online, our planner?
I'm here.
Ah,
Hi, everyone.
hey there. How are you? So,
Good.
the next thing we want to pick up is, just running next steps on parking requirements. I'm just going to hand it off to you, Natalie. Do you need anything before you start up?
No, that's fine. That's great.
Thank you.
So just as an update, I just watched, the council just had the public hearing on this item. I think Nick gave a thorough update of where the legislation stands right now. Based on the last time I spoke with you, the table was slightly revised to better align with the schedule of use table elsewhere in the zoning code. And then I did present the revised table and code to the planning board at their last meeting. They did not issue an official letter, but I think in general there was support for the revisions that have been made to make the document more user-friendly and the reduction of the table to kind of consolidate parking requirements into one smaller table. So I think, and the usability of that was supported. I think we can get an official letter from them if we want, but it was more of a general conversation. I did open the conversation with them about what factors we should maybe be tracking to kind of keep an eye if this legislation is adopted, to kind of track it as it moves through. And I think we just discussed keeping better track of the table of kind of projects that move through, what the ratio is of parking spaces, where the planning board determines the parking should stand, and that way we can kind of track it over the year. But other than that, there was no major revisions kind of proposed to the code by the planning board at large. I think in terms of next steps, I would just want to discuss with the council, I think if there's any other changes that they would want to see made to the document. Otherwise, we need to recirculate to the county. I think it's changed quite a bit since the county last reviewed and gave their comments on this draft legislation. So I think that would be the next step, is circulate that so we can get those county comments updated. But that's it. I won't go back through, all the materials unless there's specific questions, but nothing has changed since the last presentation that Nick gave the night of the public hearing.
Okay, any thoughts, comments based on public hearing or other questions?
I appreciate you aligning it to the schedule of uses, like what Amber brought up the last time we talked about this in workshop. I think that helps make it clear, hopefully both for the planning board and the public as well.
And I appreciate you asking them about the metrics that could be incorporated for tracking over time. I am interested, actually, given that there was a split, the 3-2 split from the board on the initial version of the law, in a letter to see how they officially stand on a number of the components of what's being considered now, including that aspect of, where do they stand in terms of including a metric requirement for tracking over time.
I guess since-
I think the general conversation around there was the same one that we kind of had as a group, I think, at the last council meeting, and that, I think there's goals that we're trying to achieve with this. I don't think anybody's stating that reducing parking requirements or reforming parking requirements is going to be the silver bullet that increases housing supply in the city of Beacon and more affordable units. So, relying solely on that, I think the planning board is in the same way that the council was kind of struggling to, like, what would be that metric. I think we can look at larger things, but I don't think parking is one aspect that's going to impact that. That's going to depend on a lot of other policies and implementation and enforcement of other policies as well as parking. So I don't know if they would necessarily have clear guidance on what that metric should be. I think in the same way that the council came to the conversation, is it's a difficult thing to try and track. Although I think you can generally track. I wouldn't assign it just to the parking requirements, but I think we could generally be tracking the approval and provision of housing units, right? Depending on what goals you want us to track within the city. I think with the caveat that would not be subject just, that's not in direct correlation only to the parking requirements. But I think in places like Minneapolis, I know one of the members who spoke during the last public hearing, referenced other cities like Buffalo, Minneapolis, that have seen, they feel like they have seen changes or impacts to the number of housing units approved and the affordability of housing within their communities. And in those articles, I think parking reform is referenced as one of the aspects that maybe led to those changes, but not wholly. So I think similar to that, I think we can track housing the production of housing and the goal of the housing within the city. But again, I don't know if I would tie that back just to parking requirements. I think that depends on all the other things that the city is doing to try and encourage housing.
I definitely appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I don't also, I also don't think that it's just the one factor that's going to have an impact, but I do like the opportunity for looking at the metrics in the broader conversation, because this is not one policy in isolation for trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve in a number of these different elements. But again, it's an opportunity where we're opening up the law, making a change, and setting a tone, and maybe incorporating a requirement that we do tracking that can be beneficial for a number of other changes we might want to consider in time.
I'll
I'm
offer,
actually happy to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'd like to offer something specific on that I brought up earlier in this conversation. I would be very interested in, assuming that some type of legislation moves forward here, that kind of the first, maybe the first one that goes through the planning board process, we get some feedback from them on whether this, first of all, just how it went. Was it easier or harder for them? Did they understand the legislation? And then what was the overall result? So, looking at the table that we have, say it was in the CMS district and it fell into the residential use, like where did they land on this? So I don't think that would be overly difficult and would be helpful to understand as a point of feedback.
Yeah, I mean, actually, to that point, I'm glad you just reminded me of that, because we had a really kind of direct example at the last planning board meeting, right? So the last planning board meeting, there's an application on the planning board agenda for 410 Fishkill Avenue. Currently, Healy Hyundai, or formerly a Healy Hyundai auto sales facility, right? And right now, the current applicant looking to use that space is Carvana. So again, another kind of car-oriented, but a much newer model of how car sales kind of function and occur in the newer markets. I'm happy to explain the Carvana model as best I understand it if anyone's not familiar with that. But I think where we started talking about this with the planning board and where it kind of turned some light bulbs on for the planning board in this conversation is the code as it currently stands requires parking based on both the number of employees as well as the square footage of floor space. And so for the size of the building, it is requiring 125 to 128 parking spaces depending on the employee number. They give us a range of employees, right? So 125 to 128 parking spaces. Carvana is proposing, based on, they've given us kind of the numbers of cars they're going to need to store on site, how many employees, they don't keep a large amount of cars. They're saying, that they have, I think it was, let me just look how many spaces, 70 spaces on site, right? And they feel like that those 70 spaces that are on site are absolutely sufficient for this use. The proposed legislation requires 51 to 84. Right, so that 70 that they're saying this is more than enough, this fits our need, and is actually what is provided on the site, falls within this new range that we're proposing. And then, I just think, that gives it a little bit more tracking to just show that some of the parking requirements as they stand are just being right-sized, right? That they are just they've been for so long, this ridiculous number, to the point where Healy didn't even have 125 to 128 parking spaces for this use that's been functioning here for a number of years. They must have received some kind of variance or something like that in the past, or maybe we're tagging other parcels around. So, to that point, I think there was a real life example that came up in front of the planning board where we were able to theoretically apply the proposed regulations, and it fit much more appropriately than the current regulations.
Yeah, that's a really good example, and I was reading that one with interest too, because their model is very different than what I had assumed. So, yeah, I mean, even if it's just something similar to, I think maybe Bruce had pulled a table together of, I think that would be interesting, and just in general, I would like some feedback from our planning board when things like this go through, if it actually made things easier or more difficult for them. The other thing that I wanted to kind of pose to the council, and we can come back to this, is that, obviously there's a lot of discussion that we're having around affordability, and we're all saying that, there's not any one thing This is probably one of many tools in the toolbox, but it feels like we're at a point where maybe the heavy lifting on this one is done. And so I would love for us to maybe at the next workshop, take a look at the housing priorities that Molly was tracking, and maybe we can pick a couple of those to start moving forward with as this one is dying down. I think another example of this legislation that we should also revisit is ADUs. Is that working as expected? Yes or no? I think the answer is no. But there's a lot of other things on that list that we could maybe pick up and pick a couple of things to start on.
Yep. You know, it's funny because I'm fully in agreement with you. Natalie and I had a conversation toward the end of the week about whether we should put this on the table now. And the 2 cents was the state's in the middle of legislation and we should try to finish parking. But I'm with you, which is it's coming soon. Right?
Yeah, I feel like there's no reason we can't get started and at least understand, like, of the council, what are the things that we would pick as our next best options, and just lay out like where we are with those things so that we can move forward regardless of what the state does.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, even if we just use that list that you had put forward, Lee, a couple of years ago that we worked from, I think that's a good starting point anyway, just so we have everything on the table. But I do think we're ready to, we haven't sealed the deal on this thing, but I think we're ready to talk about two things at once.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I think we're getting close as well. So Natalie, I forwarded you that document, and you and I discussed it. You thought you could update it a little bit, but that might be the right starting point that Dan suggests as well. So
And, yeah.
I think we're all saying very similar things.
And then send it to Kathy Hochul, and she'll put the last edits on it.
There you go.
I was going to say, the thing, I don't know how much, Natalie, I assume you actually are paying attention to the housing-related parts of the state budget for your many roles that you're serving, not just for the city. So if you look at our priorities and are already aware of state initiatives that are likely to come through, if you could kind of highlight those for us as well, I think that would be great. We would definitely rely on your expertise for that. I had a specific question related to the language of the law. I think one of our constituents brought up in public comment around that. What I think they were saying, and I don't know if Nick is online, this might be a more of a legal question, was that we've taken out the old section B1 of 223-26 around exemptions, and so not the one that's about, I think that the section B, or B2, I think is the one we were kind of focused on. That's one that no longer fits with the city of Beacon, but B1 is basically, if you live in a single-family home, this doesn't apply to you. And my legal question is around, because we certainly have a lot of houses where they don't have even one parking space, off-street parking, because of the way that the city is, and I didn't want us to pass a law that all of a sudden.
Can you back up just a little bit?
Oh.
We're having trouble hearing you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is that better there?
Yeah,
Am I a little too hot? Yeah, so do you understand my question, Nick, and you can weigh in on that?
I do understand the question. I've not looked at it. I did not recall that from the meeting, but I do see in B1 where we've stricken it. So I'd have to go back and give it more thought rather than just, if during this discussion I can come up with an answer and look at it, I'll respond to your question. Otherwise, I'll get back to you and make sure we respond to it and address it. I don't know, Natalie, if you've had a chance to look at it?
Yeah, I think I remember that comment from the public hearing that I just reviewed. I guess from mine, I'm coming into this, right, I think the draft was a little bit already established when I first came in as the city's planner, and that 1980, I think it was the
64.
64 exemption was already stricken, right? So I guess for me, it would be helpful to better understand. I can look back through John's files and try and find, but the opposition to that, the opposition to that exemption in terms of why it was removed. And I think we can look at the single family home. I hear that issue definitely in terms of we don't want to impose a new unnecessary hardship, I think, on single family homes that are built in a more historic fashion that don't have parking on site from being able to continue their use. So I understand the need, but I think in order to suggest revisions, I need to understand a little bit better why that exemption was stricken. I don't know if Nick, if you have that information, or maybe the council remembers that conversation.
Well, the intended that section in B1 and 2 of the 1964 exemption only kicks in when there is a new use proposed. It doesn't require that if you were non-conforming, you didn't provide parking, that you now have to provide the parking. And under this law, that wouldn't change it. You would be considered non-conforming yet but permitted, so that you don't need to bring your parking up to code. But if you wanted to add additional units, you would need to comply with the new code. What the 1964 exemption in B1 and B2 provides, that a little bit of an exemption, you don't need to meet the new code if you can show that you meet this criteria pertaining to you're not increasing the intensity of the use beyond a certain percentage. And I think the planning board recommended, as did John Clark, that this language be removed because it created some confusion, required a little bit of homework to determine what the use was back in 1964, what the parking requirement was, and how this new use would impact that. So it was thought best to bring it current and remove that ambiguity.
Yeah.
I
And
guess
I don't
the
believe-
issue, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, so I don't believe it impacts the existing uses or the single-family home, and it would have only applied if there was going to be an increase in the intensity of the use of that single-family home.
The language on that today is very odd because it says any structure erected prior to or after April 20th of 1964. So like if you were built on April 20th, 1964, you're good, but everything else is subject to that. Yeah, I don't think that language makes a lot of sense. So that's what we're saying, we're taking that whole category out.
Yeah, and I'm
Correct.
fine to take it out for the reasons you described, Nick. It was more the comment seemed to bring up that maybe, and maybe you kind of answered this already with the idea that existing non-conforming, it's already protected in other parts of this law, or just city code in general. I just wanted to make sure we weren't creating a further headache in changing things. But I personally am fine with getting rid of the main issues with those two sections that you already outlined, Nick, and that both our previous planner and the planning board agreed with.
Good, and I'll also review it with Bruce just to make sure we don't have any unintended consequences. Just make sure we think it all the way through. I appreciate the comment.
Okay.
So if you all will indulge me, I missed the last couple workshops, and I wanted to raise a couple things, if it's all right. So I'm looking at the table that was introduced last week, and I just wanted to propose to the group that we move the T zone from the first section to the section on the right. And the reason that we have this first column here with no minimums is because it's very hard for these property owners to really fit parking in, right? Like the CMS, the linkage. But I think the T district isn't tested well enough yet. I think we've only had one or two projects that have been approved there, and the T zone, this transition zone, is, for the public's knowledge, runs along the behind the CMS zone, behind the Main Street zone, and I think the character of those neighborhoods behind Main Street can vary a little bit. There's some areas where there's like some really obvious parking options, and then there's some others that don't, and are a little tight. And so I wanted to propose, as a temporary measure at least, that the T-zone kind of be treated a little more carefully, and that we have a proposed minimum for that zone until we see what some of the projects that come through look like. And I do have in mind one project that was proposed not too long ago on Fishkill Avenue, and you know, it concerned me that perhaps the lack of a minimum on that project could have really have impacted parking in that neighborhood. So, you know, is anyone else open to looking at the T-zone a little differently here?
So, yeah, actually, Natalie, you and I had a conversation about that, and what I asked you to do was to consider whether it might make more sense to be in the other category, which is what, you know, Dan is suggesting, or if you leave it here, that you have language that helps it along. Have you kind of considered that and just wondered what your logic was in leaving it on the left side?
Yeah, so I think, as we discussed, it was left on the left-hand side, basically because it fell within some of the similar categorizations in terms of how we were dividing those two sets of districts up originally, right? In terms of the T districts are, as Dan was mentioning, are, proximate to the CMS district, in close proximity to kind of Main Street. So for that reason, they kind of fit within one of the categorizations is this closer to kind of more walkable environments, areas where there is municipal parking and or public transit. And then I think the other aspect of why it was initially kept on that left-hand side was also because the transition aspect of the district is already in many ways kind of regulated by the uses that are permitted within that district, right? It is transitional in that the focus becomes much more heavily on housing and there's limited kind of commercial uses, smaller limited commercial uses that are permitted on the ground floor within buildings in the T district. So for those reasons, we felt that it more closely lined up with how we were categorizing CMS, linkage, waterfront districts, and so it was placed there. But I think to your point, that was a point of conversation because it is transitional, and so I think can go one or two ways. And I think the idea was there's only so many areas in the city where where the city can look to really kind of increase density and utilize this reduced parking requirement or reform parking requirements as a means to increase the highest and best use of land, which in our case is for housing for people rather than parking spaces for cars. And so noting that those districts are limited throughout the city, I think we made the decision to keep T on the left-hand side with these areas that could potentially support more housing, less on-site parking. Not saying there's not parking available, but less parking on the individual site. So those are the reasons, but I think I'm open to hearing council's discussions on which column they feel most comfortable with.
Yeah. I think those are all very valid points. The intent of the transition district, as you may have stated, is literally to be 50% the density, halfway the density between the CMS and the adjacent residential zone. And the reason that I worry about having the transitional zone in this left-hand column is because the T zone does abut right up to the residential zones. And we have had issues in the past where when parking was limited, I think in one case because of that 1964 law, that we had to start putting a lot of parking on a residential street, which made it very difficult for people to get out of their driveways. And on the merits of the merits of the arguments you're making, I think are all very valid. I think when you start thinking about what is the impact of the people who live near this, I think there's a lot more uncertainty, and so I'd like to tread a little more carefully with the T zone, because I think that a project that goes awry could be more disruptive than, say, something that happens on the CMS zone or even in the R zone. I just think there's a little more risk with the T zone of like impacting neighborhoods and causing unnecessary congestion and frankly, blowback against this law generally.
Yeah, again, I thought this was the area, and you'd all raised this, it's not like, there's only one view, that this was an area where it's unclear. And, one of the thoughts I had, Natalie, was some sort of language, like I can give you some examples. We could leave it where it is and have language that says, should the planning board decide that parking is an issue in this immediate area that they're considering, that they would then apply the right-hand side. We could put it on the right-hand side and do just the opposite, put language that says, if the planning board decides that there, isn't an issue or there are valid reasons, or we could kind of leave it to them. Because I think we need some flexibility in here, because I'm looking at the T-zone, and most of it is, it's very thin, there's only a few number of parcels, and I think it's going to vary. So I hear what you're saying. Is there some language we can give them that gives the planning board some options, right?
Yeah. I like the idea of flexibility there. Like, I definitely hear what Dan is saying, and I think maybe a happy medium is in places, because we want to get away from like requiring having a whole bunch of parking if it's not needed. So I like the idea of incorporating language, whichever side of the table it sits on, that gives some discretion for that specific zone, because it is kind of this, you know, in and out. So I don't know that it does really fit in one place perfectly, and having some discretion to apply a different metric there, I think is a good call for that area. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm open to that. I think what we just want to acknowledge is that I don't think we've seen a project yet that
Yeah.
fully utilizes what the T-zone can do. I think we've seen one proposal, maybe two. So I think that there's, you know, yes, we know what types of uses, and the planning board could probably, you know, build off of that, but I think when it comes to these, it's thin, but there's some neighborhoods that are very different than others, you know?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, like I think of something on DeWint is going to be very different than something on Van Nydek or something.
what I
So,
don't want
yeah.
is another Van Nydek, and you know that's what I'm thinking of.
And so that would suggest that the criteria would be, you know, something like where the planning board finds that the neighborhood has parking, you know, either because it's near city lots, or they've done you know, that there's availability based on our parking, that they would use the left-hand side, the you know, the less
The no minimum.
intensive parking standards. But where there's a limitation as to parking, you know, you want to say, look, there's not any room here, you're going to have to do something. Some language like that. Would that pick up what we're thinking about?
I think so.
I like that, yeah.
Natalie, could we do something like that, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll work on it.
Okay, it's sort of, if we get the language right, it almost doesn't matter which category we put it in, right?
Right, it just, yeah, I think the idea is, you know, again, very valid point from Dan, that there hasn't been a ton in this district, it's a newer district, so let's kind of hedge our bets and make sure we don't, you know, cut something off that is going to end up being needed. So yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on which side of the table it goes on, as long as there's some discretion that allows the planning board to make the right decision.
And just to, not for this law, so I apologize, I'm bringing up a different topic, but we've talked about having a joint meeting with the planning board and actually talking about the transitional zone. This might be a good fit, just to talk about generally what was intended here, what has come through here, like are there any tweaks we want to make to that zone, because I think they might have some thoughts as well around that. Should we ever do that joint meeting some point in the future?
What was it back there before, what was there before the transition zone?
There were
was
multiple
linkage.
different zones.
It was parking.
Yeah, it was like, it was
was
general
P-
business and parking, and I think there was some linkage. It was a couple of
PB,
different
something called
things. Yeah,
PB.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remember, this was supposed to be where all the parking was when Main Street
Yeah.
was going to be a mall,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And so we said, all right, we got to get rid of that. But okay, can you consider what we've said between Natalie and Nick, and then come back with language, and then where you think it belongs, given the language you come up with? Because I think we're all saying it's the language that matters more. Is that all right?
Yeah, I mean, it's all guidance language too, right? None of this is binding it to anybody, to the planning board. Right. The planning board can choose to ignore both minimums and maximums in this table.
Is that how it works?
I mean, it depends, so the planning board would use the maximums, and they would fall somewhere in between there when determining parking requirements for projects on the right-hand side, on the right-hand column.
Right, but if, say they're working on a district in the right-hand column, they couldn't go below the minimum and they couldn't go above the maximum, could they? We don't give them that discretion, do we?
No, if that discretion would be up to the ZBA. If an applicant was trying to go below what the planning board was determining was the parking requirement, I think, because the way the code reads is that the planning board shall determine the parking requirement, right? So they'll set a number on somewhere, either the minimum or the maximum, or maybe somewhere in the middle. And then I think if the applicant, and once that's determined, I think if the applicant wanted to deviate from that, they would need to go to the ZBA if they were seeking something lower than that.
So in the reason that I asked that question is because in the paragraph right before the table, it says the following table gives guidance to the planning board. It doesn't say these are the limits that the planning board has to adhere to or applicants have to adhere to. It says guidance, and I know how important language is when we're writing these laws, and guidance sounds a little fluffy.
Well, but two paragraphs above in subdivision 2, it says the planning board shall determine the appropriate number of on-site parking spaces. And we were trying to get away from a set defined number. So I think you've got to read it in totality. And so they just can't blatantly ignore it. They are bound to make a determination, make a factual basis based upon the analytical data provided to them, using the minimum and the maximum as guidance to get there. It's a bit of a formulaic approach without having specific numbers.
All right, so I think I heard the attorney and the planner say it slightly differently, actually, right? I think I heard the attorney say that the planning board would have some discretion. And I think I heard the planner say, oh no, you'd have to go to ZBA. I think we should, as a council, determine which one of those we prefer. Is
I
that
actually think we're both saying the same thing, it's just different steps. They have to comply with the minimum and the maximum and keep it within that. If an applicant does not satisfy the minimum or the maximum, then they would have to go to the ZBA to get a variance, and that's where Natalie took us to the next level.
Okay, so now you're both saying the same thing. What
Yes.
Dan is asking is that section that says guidance, does that guidance word need to be clarified to be clear that you can't go below the minimum without a variance, you can't go above the maximum without a variance? I think that's what you're asking, right, Dan?
Yeah.
Can I say a third thing?
Yes.
There.
Hi,
Hi.
Paloma.
Appreciate everyone accepting me joining remotely. But I think this piece of the puzzle is getting at one of my continued questions on this topic, which is how we're operationalizing the public benefit here. And I mean that in terms of the use of the parking in lieu policy. And I believe where we left that conversation a couple of weeks ago is determining whether or not the purpose of the parking in lieu policy was to compensate for the minimum parking that potentially couldn't be provided by the development, or if we were recognizing that this was a leverage point for an ongoing public benefit to invest in parking alternatives for the city. And I'm just personally not clear where we landed on it, and I would, my decision point on what we have been discussing so far about where we draw these lines is contingent on clarification on that question of where we're landing the ongoing public benefit.
So part of that discussion is that from a staff level, we felt that we were mixing the two together, not getting clear discussions or direction. So we needed to first agree upon the text and the tables and the parking minimums and maximums. And then once we had concurrence on that, we were going to come back and talk to you about the fee in lieu of, and talk about the legal constraints on that and different ways that it could be crafted. Because I felt it was easier and a more manageable discussion to break it off in that way. So it really is a two-part. This local law will have both components to it, but we needed to bring the first part of the discussion to closure to make sure we were actually going to conceptually go ahead with revisions to the code. And now that it appears, at least conceptually, we have landed on the chart and these revisions, we'll come back to you with the next part of the discussion.
Okay, I appreciate that, Nick, and I do understand setting up the broader structure before we determine where exactly the minimums lie to determine the public benefit. I guess I look forward to that next stage of the discussion.
Understood. And I think it sounds like we have, Mayor, a little bit of tweaking to do, but conceptual understanding with respect to what's being presented. I do think it would be beneficial to get some comments from the county on this and give them an opportunity. We'd likely have to go back a third time when we introduce the minimum concept, but I do think it allows the discussion to proceed. So now that you're comfortable, I think you and I can make some of the revisions discussed tonight, send that to the county with the board council's concurrence, knowing that this is still a work in progress. And you'll have other opportunities to review it and comment on it.
I think there's plenty of changes for the county to comment on now, and then some of their feedback might even help us, I think, in this direction and where we're going in terms of, transitional zones and fees and things like that. So I think I'm more than happy to get county input now on this draft, and then again, once it's finalized, or more finalized.
What do we want to hear from the county before we have a conversation about fees? Like, shouldn't we finish the fees conversation before we send it to the county? So we only send it to them in one shot, or is there a couple steps here for them as well?
Dan, we can do it either way. I think the benefit is it becomes a more manageable and focused discussion. And with the
Sorry,
county,
more manageable what?
and
focused.
focused review and discussion. And I think we're really introducing a different concept here, getting away from the textual aspect and putting it into a chart format, that I think there's some advantage to getting feedback on that aspect of these revisions at this time. And then when you go back on the fee in lieu of, it's going to be focused comments just on that aspect of it. You can do it either way. I'm just trying to advance the discussions and get some things checked off in advance so we get feedback. The county may have comments that you find beneficial to further revise this local law.
Okay.
I don't know,
Thanks.
Natalie, if you have any thoughts or different views?
No,
No,
I
just
think
curious.
that's fine. So,
Yeah, okay.
We've only been talking about fees in lieu of, but we could just be talking about fees, right? Because what I was looking at in this chart was that, while there may not be a minimum anymore, you can't really have a fee in lieu of something where that wouldn't exist in the first place, but you could just have a fee, right?
Well, that's part of a larger discussion. I've got to complete my review and comment on it when we come back to you in 2 weeks.
Okay.
great. All right. I think we're okay on this component. Remember, we're keeping them in steps, right?
Yeah, we don't have our next public hearing till the 20th, right? So we have another workshop, of May, to talk about this.
Okay.
Sorry, Paloma, were you saying something, or
Yep.
Natalie?
Thanks, Molly. That was me. I was trying to not do a back and forth via Zoom, but there were a few other little items I wanted to note that came up in discussion. One of them was around the discussion on metrics. And I wanted to appreciate that what I heard was that the metrics that seemed realistic were particularly based on parking as opposed to housing affordability. And it felt important to note, since this is a workshop and we're trying to exchange ideas, that it felt like this particular piece of legislation the impact of it would be felt more around our carbon and climate impact than on our housing impact. Both are important, both are critical for our city, but I wanted to note that that is what I'm hearing about both what is measurable on this legislation and what the impact might be. I don't know where that goes. I don't know how we track that, but it felt important to say. I also wanted to note a little bit, I think it was Molly who noted that since this is our housing-focused item on the agenda for our workshop, there are a couple of state priorities that have been articulated in the budget. And I do want to voice my support that if it does become clear that good cause eviction is something that we can take up as a city in the future, That is something that I will continue to support. And I also wanted to note, as a sort of fourth vote on including priorities to our workshop agenda in an ongoing conversation. I know that the conversation was broadly around including our housing priorities broadly, and I also want to voice my support specifically towards including a revisit to our inclusionary zoning law, particularly towards increasing our percentage within the inclusionary zoning law. I don't need us to necessarily discuss that further, but wanted to voice my support for those ideas.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other comments on the one in front of us? Okay, so why don't we do this? I think we've got a set of next steps for the attorney and the planner to do. And we said we want to advance this piece, and then we're going to look at the fees piece of the puzzle as we advance that. And we also said that we would then also start to think about what other things are on our agenda with respect to zoning, right? Okay, cool. Is it all right if we go on?
Mm-hmm.
We good? Okay.
Thanks,
the
Natalie and Nick.
Thank you.
Yep,
Have a good
thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you both. Good night, Natalie. I think, Nick, you're still around for sewer infrastructure. Chris, you've got the next two, which is there's some budget amendments. Let's do those first.
Okay, so we have a proposed budget amendment to the general fund to cover the repair of highway equipment. We have a grinder that's manufactured by Moorbark that takes all of our brush and chips it so that we can compost it. A major bearing in the hub broke on that. We estimate that the worst case scenario is it's a $40,000 repair. We're hoping it can be rebuilt for less, but we do need to authorize that. So your first transfer would be from contingency $40,000 into repair of equipment. I know some of you want me to track the contingency when we do this, that leaves us at $41,000 in contingency in the general fund, unrelated to severances and retirement, which are separate. The second item is for severances, and it's actually all severances. We had two people in our water department leave for other jobs, and we lost 2 police officers in the last 3 or 4 months. So these are the accruals being paid out in 2 funds. You see the A fund, we're transferring $66,103 to the A fund, that's for the police officers, and then transferring $19,176 to the F fund, which is water. And so that comes out of a specific water contingency fund. And you can see we used up the transfers from 2 different contingency funds within water, and then the retirement contingency fund for the general budget. We call it contingency retirement, but it's also for severances.
Mhm. And the contingency fund balance of 41,000,
Is in the general fund.
it seems a little low for this time of year? No? Do you know how it stands up to previous? We started with what, 200,000?
No, we started with 100.
100,
So
okay.
we started low this year because we thought some of the things that we had in prior years that might come up
Mhm.
weren't coming up.
Okay.
So we have other things that, again, if we get short, we have other places to move money from.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions on this one? Any other stuff? All right. Chris, you want to take us through the next one, which is a proposed agreement for floating docks with the Beacon Sloop Club?
Yes. So, Ben, can you put up the graphic in the back of the agreement, please? We were notified recently that the floating docks that were previously owned by the Beacon Institute or Clarkson University were being sold to the Beacon Sloop Club. We had agreements going back, according to our records, at least to 2009, where we had an agreement for them to put the docks in, and to hook up to our property there. And it mainly involved having insurance certificates to make sure that we were protected. Those docks have been used by the Sloop Club for the Woody Guthrie, and also for Bannerman Castle Trust running their tour boat operations. What we're proposing is to renew the agreement essentially in the same form it was with Beacon Institute, but now it's with the Beacon Sloop Club. That had expired, I guess, in 2018, and we just realized it needed to not only change hands, but be renewed. So we're proposing to do that for 5 years with 2 renewable 5-year terms after that.
And, go ahead.
And luckily, nothing happened in those intervening 5 years.
Let me do some pointing out on the
Okay.
on the map. The portion that the city owns is where the trees are, which is a portion of Long Dock, is that right?
Ben, can you blow that up a bit and use your cursor? So,
I can't zoom in, but I can use my cursor if you want to
Okay.
tell me where to point.
so if you go to the south dock,
Right.
the floating dock is the one that's taken out every year, stored, and then put back. And you can see there's a small ramp that connects it to our shore connection, which is essentially part of our park system there. And you can see the ferry pier is to the north of that, and the Sloop Club is just to the north and east of there. Yes.
Right, so
Very
there's,
good.
there's a little bit of the dock area that the city owns, and that's where the floating dock connects to, right?
No. No, so we own the shoreline, and they're connecting to the shoreline via the ramp to the floating dock.
I'm sorry, I
The
missed
ferry
that, yeah.
pier is a whole different arrangement,
Yes.
where we own the static pier, and then the floating barge that they use to load the ferry and unload the ferry is Metro North.
That's the upper one.
That's the upper one, yeah.
Not
And
to
that's where the
compli-
Clearwater also, the Clearwater has an arrangement with Metro North to embark and disembark there.
So I always thought that Beacon ended at the shoreline and then it was Fishkill.
You're correct,
So why are we doing this deal and not Fishkill?
because we own the land.
Oh, really?
And you have to
That's
cross
why-
our land to
Oh.
hook up your dock in Fishkill. Yes. And also, you
But they're
know,
not an interested party? They can't say anything about this? I mean, I don't think they would, but.
And also pursuant to the LWRP that was approved by the New York State Department of State, the city has that authority over the harbor.
yeah, so actually in our code, there's a whole section of the harbor, and I'm actually the harbor master. So, yes.
Well, you're the Commodore.
To get you a little
I would
hat.
like a Greek fisherman's cap, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll
right.
bring in mine.
All right,
right.
good.
I had just two things that I think are quick. Have we taken a look at the shoreline to see if any like restoration is needed there, just from the dock kind of potentially wearing away some of the land?
We've been doing work down there, and it wasn't evident to our crews that we needed any shoring up of the large stones that are there.
Okay.
And you can see, like, where the dock is, there's a little piece of land that we used to call the dog leg, and it's along Scenic Hudson's property. And we've been cleaning that up. We took a lot of the invasive bushes out of there, cleaned up a lot of debris. Our guys did a installation of a concrete pad for future picnic tables that are going there, and
Oh,
you'll
nice.
see we've been planting trees. We've put a couple memorial benches, and trying to just upgrade that area a little bit. But
That's
the
good to
shore
hear.
looked fine, and again, if we hear that that's an issue, we're going to have equipment down there anyway.
Okay, good to know. And then just the second piece, which I don't know if I missed it, but I'm assuming this has already been discussed. It looks like Robert May is the person at the Sloop Club who's the representative.
Yes.
So they're good with all of this and,
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, this is still in draft form, so there might be a little bit of tweaking to the agreement, but it's generally, it's a no-cost agreement, and all we need is insurance.
Okay.
And then they'll be able to do arrangements with other vendors as long as we get their insurance.
great, thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. All right. Next one
Hey,
is.
can I just ask one other question, Lee? I'm sorry. I get questions sometimes about why our waterfront isn't as developed as other communities, and I really quite like our waterfront the way that it is. But is there the ability to create other docks, or could we enter into agreements like this with other organizations? And what governs all of that? Is that's all here at this table, and we decide what happens with the waterfront?
Nick, help?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of making sure any use of the waterfront is consistent with the LWRP. Also, DEC, I believe, might have some regulation over the placement of docks within the water bodies. And then it is controlled by, I think it's chapter 31 or 81 regarding harbor management.
Okay, I'll
So
take it.
yes, you do have
And
some
permanent
ability.
docks are a lot harder. Like Lee and I were on the council when we approved that dock back in the mid-90s, and it took years to get through Army Corps of Engineers. 'Cause
Oh, yeah.
It was shading like sturgeon habitat or something. And again, you're limited to what you can do on the waterfront. The whole area by Long Dock is subject to inundation by flood water. We have no water or sewer on this side, like the Sloop Club essentially uses a compost toilet. We use porta-johns down at the riverfront. So you have limited things you could do down there just because the railroad controls so much of the property. So much of it is below the high flooding levels, and then also infrastructure.
Yeah.
And our comprehensive plan covers the land portion, and, the community felt like, leave it the way it is, right? I think there is the ability to do something like a restaurant on the Long Dock.
As long as
section.
it has a bathroom.
Yeah, right? And that was about it, right? So, and that might change over the years, but that's how it works right now.
But with the way it floods, it's hard to put much there.
Yeah,
I agree, right?
a little in your car.
Yeah, don't park there either.
Well, I've been going to the station for a long time, and I remember the first time that it flooded and thinking it was really an extraordinary circumstance, and now it's happening
Yeah.
really a lot.
Yeah.
They have signs up now, it's been happening every few months.
But it's good to have this arrangement. I think the Sloop Club's done a good job over the years of, keeping that area vibrant, teaching people how to get out on the Hudson. I think it's a good group of people to have down there.
All right? Good?
Wonderful.
Okay. So next one is about sewer infrastructure and a proposed dedication. And Nick, you're going to tell us how to understand this, right?
I'll see you tomorrow.
I am, Mayor. Thank you. So this concerns the Edgewater project, and the council has previously, on a number of other projects, accepted water pipes, sewer infrastructure. Perhaps it's a sight line easement, perhaps it's a fire hydrant, or perhaps it's a portion of a road or a sidewalk. So this is where the city would be accepting dedication of an infrastructure improvement. In this case, it's the sanitary sewer pipes for the Edgewater project that connects to the city's existing trunk line out on Branch Street. This, you may recall that the city approved a local law that allowed this property and other similarly situated ones to go through a process called internal lot subdivisions. Previously, this was envisioned that the sanitary sewer infrastructure would be maintained by the property owner because it was serving one property. The unintended or unforeseen consequence of the internal lot subdivision was that when that occurred, the Dutchess County Department of Health said that since it is now going to be multiple lots under potentially different ownership, it requires either the creation of a transportation corporation or that the city agree to accept an offer of dedication. So a transportation corporation is in essence a private utility for water or for sewer where it serves more than one property. Under New York State law, if a transportation corporation for a utility is formed, the city has to consent to it. The city can impose obligations of bonding, typically 5 years. And if at any point in the future the system is not maintained, the property owner could walk away and abandon it. or offer it up to the city. And the city at that point, having approved a transportation corporation, would have to accept that infrastructure then coming into the city in whatever condition it's at that time. So generally, transportation corporations are frowned upon for that reason, and it's beneficial for a municipality to operate the utilities because that's what the municipality knows how to do, among other things, right? Operate the sewer and the water system. You have professionals to deal with that. So with respect to this offer of dedication, the city would be accepting the sanitary sewer main. It would be subject to inspections and a maintenance bond for a period of a year or two after it's accepted for dedication and inspected by the city. But we have the additional benefit that's being negotiated with respect to this offer of dedication because of the circumstances, whereby the applicant has agreed to make a payment of $100,000 that will be paid over a period of 5 years. So in addition to accepting the offer of dedication, the city will be accepting an agreement that requires, and will be recorded against the property, requiring that the city receive a payment of $100,000. And this requires a council vote to accept the offer.
And I just want to make clear, like, absent the internal subdivision, we wouldn't have had this choice. And so I went back to the developer and I said, firstly, you know, we not only frown upon transportation corporations, we are not going to approve them. It's just leaving a time bomb for the next generation of leaders here. And we've had the same conversation with the developers of hip lofts about their pump station and force main. So with that, I said there needs to be some consideration for the replacement value of this. The life of the facility is probably minimum 50 years, maximum probably about 100 years. We made the offer of the $100,000 based on the replacement cost, and both our engineer and our attorney thought that was a good number. It was accepted without any back and forth. So we feel very solid about that number, and we think we can do a better job maintaining our infrastructure than having a transportation corporation that might go away in 5 years. So this kind of is a win-win for us, and we would put that money towards the multitude of sewer projects that we have to buy down our eventual bonding.
So I did ask if it could go in the general fund, and I was told no.
No.
So
this will go into the sewer fund.
Okay. And it was, this, what we're taking over here is well-built and not...
Well, that's another...
not a lemon?
No, it wouldn't be a lemon. I mean, again, I think their engineer signed off on it. We are going to take an extra level of analysis on it by having the whole thing televised at their expense. So we need to make sure that the pipe is whole and good, and then we'll turn it over to the city.
Okay.
So
we had inspected the water as they were doing it, because that was part of the original deal. We were going to take on the water. We didn't do those inspections with this, but the engineer did sign off.
So we receive it after all the construction costs are incurred by the developer?
I'm sorry?
We receive it after they've done all the construction, so we're not
Yes.
paying for any of the construction of it?
No.
And there's no additional maintenance that we were incurring by this arrangement? We would have been...
It's small. We're supposed to inspect it every 5 years. That doesn't always happen on every line. Often we're mostly just going after problem areas. There might be a little bit of clean out over the 50 years. We think the $100,000 more than covers that, because that's present day dollars. And you know, again, if this has a 100-year life facility, we did pretty well, and if it's a 50-year life facility, we did pretty well.
Okay, everybody all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Last one, and I just sent you all an email. There's no request, there's no action or motion. I just want to give you an FYI. You know, like you, I saw the article in the Current on the 3 communities in Putnam, the town of Phillipstown, and the villages of Nelsonville and Cold Spring came out with some statement about not wanting the Fjord Trail to start in their communities. I tried to get up to speed on what that was about. There was an earlier statement by 5 people on a committee called the Visitation Data Committee that was put together by the Fjord Trail folks. And we have a member that I appointed to it, Sarah Mencher, and I sat with her and just talked with her about, like, what's going on here? And what I what I've learned, and this is what I thought, which is the Visitation Data Committee was the Fjord Trail folks were going to use consultants to try to project what visitations would be, and that they would present that data to members of that committee. I appointed Sarah. She has a master's in public administration. She's worked for the Economic Development Group in New York City, and so she has a great background to assess this. Her 2 cents was that the 5 members, apparently I didn't know this at the time, but 5 members of this committee are from the 2 villages in the town in Putnam, and there's 1 member from the city of Beacon and 1 member from the town of Fishkill. The 5 members put out some joint statement in the middle of the process saying, we don't agree, or we think the data's wrong. I haven't seen the exact letter. I just want you to be aware that that's occurring. And I'm of the inclination, and I have spoken to the town supervisor of Fishkill, he is of the same view, that we're concerned that a relatively objective committee, whose job it is to assess data, may not be doing that. And so I think we're going to raise some concerns and ask that there be additional representation for our 2 communities in the process. You know, just for relative sizing, the 2 communities in Dutchess affected by the Fjord Trail have a population of about 40,000. The 3 communities in Putnam, a population of 10,000. I certainly respect their viewpoints. I don't want to denigrate, you know, what any elected official in Putnam is doing, but I do want a data process to be objective, and I do want us to be fully represented. So I just want to let you know that. I want to make sure that you had any concerns, and I'll be talking to the supervisor of Fishkill about wanting us to be more actively involved in the process. And I hope that's okay.
Sure is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I feel very positive about this project and would love to support the Fjord Trail. I appreciated the presentation we got a couple of weeks ago. You know, I hope that they're still entertaining that starting point in Beacon that we kind of lobbed at them. That would be really wonderful. So I think if there's things that we can do to support the vision of the trail and make sure that Beacon is well cared for in this process, I'm very happy to do that.
Yeah, the major issue as I read it was that they're just concerned about it starting right in the village of Cold Spring, that there's a point north of Cold Spring where they would be more content with it starting.
They can start here if they like.
Yeah, we've suggested
Start
start in
start
the
and
north
stop
and
here.
build southward.
I just want to add, you know, we had, Justice and I hosted an event last year with the Hudson Highland Fjord Trail team, like an informational session in Beacon, and it was resoundingly supportive from everybody in the room. There was nobody really, I mean, people raised important things, you know, about like what happens with trash and, you know, will there be emergency services, what have you. But it was, you know, Beacon was really supportive of this project.
Yeah. That's the sense I've gotten from what I've heard from people here too. So, yeah.
Well, I respect the concerns in Cold Spring. I'm very glad you're pursuing the route you are, just so we can get a better insight into the data and what's happening with that assessment.
Yeah, and again, I'm being very cautious in terms of what I want to say, simply because I want to be respectful of the communities, just as you've suggested, Jeff. On the other hand, everything I think we're hearing from our community and what I heard from the Fishkill supervisor is very, very positive on our end. And so, you know, just not wanting the process that's supposed to be an objective review of data to turn into something, you know, more political. I just want to very cautiously say we want to be more involved. We want additional representation. You know, so I just want to make sure that you're all comfortable with that, and it represents the views of what we're hearing in the community, and then, you know, we'll keep moving forward. But again, you know, not trying to say anything regarding what those communities' concerns are as much as wanting to, assert what our community's interests are.
Yep.
Okay, that's all I got. By the way, there was a roll call. Everyone was here, including Paloma Online, except Pam, who's excused and out of the state. And then our next meeting will be on not the following Monday, that's our Monday off, because it's the 5th Monday of the month, but the one after that, which would be May 6th, that would be a regular full council meeting, and that'll start at 7.
Great.
Any other thoughts before we adjourn? Well, then I'll look for a motion.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All right, so Deanna and Jeff, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, Paloma, for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Paloma.
What's up with Van Night?